Our topic is the new face of leadership, open, authentic, transparent. Is there a new face of leadership? How is leadership changing? How is leadership development changing? And to handle those questions, I'm sitting intentionally to one side because all the wisdom is sitting over there. And so my job is just to facilitate the discussion. I'm going to let each panel member introduce themselves very briefly, and then we'll open it up, and I'm going to start with some questions, and then hopefully you can ask each other's questions and get all involved in everything. So, Lucy, why don't you begin?
Hello, everybody. My name's Lucy Dinwiddie. I am the Chief Learning Officer for Bechtel. If you don't know Bechtel, we're a company that I like to say builds civilization. We build airports, railways, subways, seaports, and power plants. So that's who I am, and I always like to say at Bechtel that I'm the Chief Learning Officer to our people.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Tobin. I'm the Dean of Choice University at Choice Hotels International. I'm fairly new in the journey at Choice, having just joined January 4th. So we're really in the reimagining, and I'm in the heavy learning phase about learning what our needs are and where we're going to focus. Prior to that, I bring really my entire career focused on learning and leadership development in various organizations. Most recently, Marriott, heading up leadership development for the entire company.
Hi, I'm Rahul Varma. I'm the Chief Learning Officer for Accenture. We are essentially a consulting, technology, and operations company with about 370,000 people around the world. I have been with Accenture for just coming up to 22 years. And I'm living in my 5th city and 3rd country. Very recently moved to New York from Singapore and really started off in India many years ago.
Good morning. Rob Lauber, Chief Learning Officer for McDonald's. Been there just under 2 years. And I think you know what we do, so I'll skip that part. And because you all hopefully ate breakfast there this morning. So I'll throw it over.
Okay, thank you. So one of the first questions I guess I would ask any of you to begin with is, since this is a panel which follows my talk, do any of you want to react to anything that I said?
I do. Yeah.
Hopefully all of you will react.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll start this, and I did sit over there, and I was thinking of Charles Dickens. It was the worst of time. It was the best of times and the worst of time, the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness. And I'm not sure if we should applaud ourselves or we should fire ourselves. And the reason I say that is you said there's bullying. Was bullying more common? You're citing it as something that's wrong. I might say that that was common practice, and we now have it as uncommon practice that's being cited as different. You talked about authenticity not being real, but maybe authenticity is being real to the moment. So I'm sitting here, and I'm not sure if I want to resign or I want to say, well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, give me a hand.
So I had some observations, and I wasn't really sure how to feel, because as I joined the panel, as I joined the conference, I thought, this is going to be a great idea for information sharing, and I'll share all the great things we're up to. And then I realized, maybe we have bigger problems that we're just not paying attention to. And the more I thought about it, I'm wondering if it's that we're just looking at them differently, or the needs are evolving, or the expectations altogether are changing. So if you were to take a leader of today and somebody who we would consider a great leader. So if any one of us thinks about the greatest leader we've ever worked for, and we think, well, what is it that made that person so great? And we take those characteristics, not only what they do, but how they make you feel as well. I do think there's something critical about how leaders make people feel, as opposed to, say, the example you used for the doctor. I do want a doctor that operates on me and does a great job, but I want to be inspired and motivated by those people who lead me. And so that's the thought that I was left with, is that there really is a place for, whether it be storytelling or making that strong emotional connection with those you lead, to inspire them to greatness. And that's what I'm going to remember, and that's, I would probably say, what I want to be remembered as, is someone who inspired others as well.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Two thoughts. The one thing that that did strike me was entertainment. Having moved to your country very recently, 9 months ago, and one of the things I don't get to do much of which is watch TV shows or reality shows, etc. Anything other than what comes at 9 p.m. around the time I'm back from work, which is CNN. And that does seem to be a lot of entertainment about the future of leadership in this country. So that did strike me as quite real to my own experience of moving here. But the other thing that I did think a lot about as you were talking was you mentioned several examples. One of the examples I didn't see you mention, which I think a lot about, is someone like Mahatma Gandhi, who actually wrote a book called My Experiments with Truth, and his book and Experiments with Truth were really experiments with diet and taking truth to its extreme. So I think there's some truth to truth.
I think I don't have much to add other than I think I was sitting at my table towards the back and felt the highs and lows from an emotional perspective. On some level, I think some people were like, that's an awfully pessimistic picture of the world. And on the other hand, it was, wow, we have huge amounts of opportunity to really make things better or to really change the trajectory within the organizations that we work, or at least go back and think differently about those things that we're doing on top of what I've already heard here.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can continue that. One of the things as I was listening to you all be introduced, one of the challenges that you must have as chief learning officers for sure is that you all are in charge of learning and development in organizations which are enormous. Yeah. And so one of the challenges in an enormous organization with respect to learning and development or culture setting through learning and development is achieving any level of consistency. And two of you work in organizations where many of the people for whom you need to achieve that consistency are not even employees. So can you describe to us how you go about dealing with this issue of trying to get a consistent set of leadership skills or behaviors and cultural values imparted in organizations which are so huge, not only in terms of numbers, but in terms of their geographic dispersion?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think McDonald's is at an interesting point from a transformation perspective, changing where it's been internally and how we've looked at the business to where we're going for the future. So I think looking at it in the past, a lot of that consistency was built out of sort of a relentless focus on operational excellence, right? And building and driving a culture that was really focused around operational excellence that helped then transcend into the other owners of our business, the thousands of other owners of McDonald's, to bring that to life. I think one of the things we're pivoting more towards now is operational excellence is great, but we need some level of customer centricity, so we need to listen more to what our customers really want as opposed to what we think they want, which is novel. And then second to that is really getting more intentional about what we want our culture to be in the organization and how we can transcend that theme of what we want our culture to be across to our franchise community as well, in terms of what we stand for, what we're all about, and behaviors, honestly, in terms of how we collaborate to bring whatever level of success we need to the organization.
And how have you actually gone about doing that?
We're just starting on that, actually. Okay. So very new on the journey in the context of pretty much an entirely new senior leader team at the helm at McDonald's right now. And that's part of the journey that we're just starting right now.
One of the things my company faces is, in fact, I just came back from the Middle East, and we're building right now in Riyadh the largest infrastructure project in the world. We're building a metro line in Riyadh, and the people who are doing this there's 4 companies that have come together in partnership. Siemens, which we all know, Amabami, which is a Lebanese company, CCC, which is a Greek company, and our company. And at this project, we have 31 different spoken languages. We have 4 different companies that have to come together and partner in a civil works joint venture. And so you can say we have Bechtel's culture, but there in Riyadh, we need to build another culture in the middle of a country that's very different than, say, the United States. And part of the way we do it is we bring people together and we talk about moments of truth, And a moment of truth, and I'm thinking about truth in terms of what you said, is where we have an obstacle or a challenge or a barrier that we need to go over, and how do we do it as a unified force? So it is very complicated. I think, though, that we build our culture through what we do today. So in effect, you have to kind of say we're building culture now.
We're the other organization that doesn't have all employees working for us. We're a 100% franchise organization. So it really is a big challenge. And like McDonald's, we started out with a focus on operational excellence. And really, that's one part out of three of our future focus. And the operational excellence is number one, service is number two, and then leadership is number three. And it's interesting, as I'm in my own learning phase and understanding what works well and what doesn't within the company, one of the consistent themes that I found that comes out is what makes one property work better than any other property, if you take out all the other variables. And it comes down to leadership and how well they execute, how well they inspire and motivate their teams and their staff. And so we're adding that dimension. So it'll be hospitality and operations, it'll be service, and then it'll be leadership. And we're really taking a shift not only on what we want people to be, but what we want people to do. And let me translate that for just a second. And so when we talk about leadership and what we want them to be, we want them to be charismatic, we want them to be authentic, and those are great characteristics. We may talk about certain behaviors that we would expect of certain leaders, but more than anything else, when it comes to learning solutions, what we're trying to do is focus on helping them do what is expected of them better, and to provide them field representation. We have basically leaders as teachers that we're utilizing, and this idea that they can really actually solve problems that are complex to the business. And so how can we set them up for solving those problems?
Can you be a little more specific?
Yeah, so specifically, if there's a leader that wants to, is having an issue with engaging their employees, we have a group of area directors that go out into the field, and they're really our front lines for helping businesses run more effectively, quite honestly. And so they'll work with the leaders of the business, and they'll say, let's look at the data. And the data suggests that your engagement scores are low, or there's some other hospitality metrics that are low. Therefore, let's serve up content to you, whether it be through coaching or some other type of content that's going to help you understand how to either operate your hotel differently, how to engage people differently, or how to deliver exceptional service. So we literally, it's almost like a doctor writing a prescription where we'll come out and understand what their challenges are based on the data, and then based on that, we can write that prescription that says, if you're having challenges with X, then here is what you should do with Y.
And in Accenture, I would ask, first tell us what you do, and then I'll ask you a specific question.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, first tell us in general how you deal with this issue of 300 and some thousand people. How do you deliver learning in a reasonably consistent way, learning and development activities to such a large group of people?
I took on this role about 4.5 years ago. It was interesting to see that poll. I have no background in learning. We have a corporate university which has been the center of our learning for many, many years. I grew up the opposite end of the world, and till 9 months ago, I did this out of Singapore. And there are two parts to this question. How did we do this, and how are we doing this, and where we are going, which is the more interesting one. As not as long ago as 15 years back, we were about 75,000 people. We were a partnership. We were largely Western Hemispheric centric. Fast forward 15 years, we're a public company with 5 different businesses, 375,000 people, 60 to 70% of which are further from Western Hemisphere than they've been before. And so this question of how we do learning has been a profoundly important one, given that we spend a lot of money on it, $840 million as of last year. And so what we realized was that this question of culture and question of learning, and being a talent-led organization, because all we have is the skills of our people, that's all we have to offer to the world, was a profound one, and one that needed dramatic change. Because the way we used to do this was, anywhere in Accenture you would join, anywhere in the world, the first thing you'd do is get shipped off to St. Charles in Chicago, and you'd go through 3 weeks of immersion, and then every couple of years you'd keep coming back and back and back. And so no matter where you would go, anywhere in the world as a client, you would experience a very consistent culture, methodology, and so on. But you can't do that at 370,000 people globally. So we basically sat through and totally revolutionized how we thought of learning. And we said, there are a couple of things that don't change, which is learning is in our DNA. That does not change. We are a learning company. So we have a very simple mantra now. It's called time away to learn and learning all the time. Time away to learn is brought to life by 3 things. We have a network of learning centers instead of one corporate university. We researched for 2 years and created a prototype of a connected classroom. And we said we're going to create 100 of them. As of today, we have 69, which are completely connected classrooms. So imagine full classrooms with multiple layers of technology. And we have built them in local offices around the world. And you can take 3 of them and teach them all together. And people can be in breakout sessions with each other together. It's just phenomenal. And then, learning all the time is more and more and more important, which is, I think, to Jim's earlier talk, which is you learn a lot from people that you work with. So we've researched architectures, and we do architectures around learning on the job. But by far, the most exciting thing I think that I didn't expect to happen is we were sitting a couple of years back with one of our group chief executives, and at that time, big data was big on his mind. And he said, guess how I'm learning about big data? And so I thought he's going to say, well, I go to the LMS and blah, blah, blah. He says, well, I'm going to YouTube. And that was a major moment for us. And we said, well, there's something to that. And then we put up a small team together, and we said, we're going to create an ability for people to learn and break through a few constraints. First, people learn the most from people they work for. So rather than my team curating learning, we made curators of our subject matter experts, our best subject matter experts. Second, learning is available everywhere. So we created an ability to get the best learning available, whether it was internal or external to Accenture. And 3, we said it has to be in the natural fabric and behavior of people so they can do how much they want, when they want. And so we invented something called learning boards. And in the 1.5 years that we've had them, we went from a handful of learning boards to over 1,000 learning boards. We had a handful of people that started. Out of our 370,000 people, over 140,000 people are actively using that. And what's most amazing to me is that there's no corporate push. We haven't asked a single human being to go and take this learning. But they're doing it because they're hungry for it, it's relevant, and it meets their needs and the demands of their life and their work. So those are some of the ways we're bringing it.
Jeff, could I just add one thing? When you asked, thank you. When you asked the question about consistency, as I was listening to what you're saying, I mean, I'm hearing the idea about it's not creation, it's curation. Yes. And you're letting the people with the intelligence create their own knowledge and their own learning. And I think that's fascinating. That's something that we're going to strive for as well. But when you asked about consistency, I feel like consistency builds cultures, but it's the flexibility and adaptability and even the level of customization that builds leaders.
That's probably right. It's also interesting, I mean, the answer talked a lot about this new technology, the learning platforms, and one of the questions I think that this panel is supposed to focus on is this issue of kind of like new leaders. I'm not sure if they're new leaders, but there's certainly new kinds of people coming into the workforce. Millennials and young people who have different kinds of expectations in terms of their social connection, different expectations in terms of their relationship to the organization, different expectations possibly with respect to their time horizon for the organization, and so on and so forth. So to what extent has the new workforce affected your approaches to delivering learning and to how even thinking about you want to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish?
I think I'll speak for McDonald's. I mean, we've been for a long time traditionally seen as sort of the first place you get a job, right? We're in that retail space. The majority of our workforce, that's where they come from. So, we see the millennials or whatever whatever we're going to call the generation entering into the workforce through businesses like mine. And so I think that what we're seeing today is, a shift a little bit more around, respect me as an individual, which I don't think is an unreasonable request, and provide me with a path, a direction. Show me where the value proposition for working here is going to take me someplace, whether it's with you or not. In our case, we don't expect most of them to stay, but I think we've begun to pay a lot more attention to the question of why should I want to work here, maybe more importantly than we've done in the past. And in other places that I've worked, in people that I stay connected to, I think you see that arising too as well. You can talk about talent shortages, or it's a more competitive marketplace for workers. It's more challenging to find skilled workers in the marketplace. So I think that attention to individual needs is growing, and I think that attention to really being clear about what your purpose and value proposition is as an employer is growing as well. So I think that's the baseline starting point. And then our learning programs have to reflect that as well, have to be matched to what the value proposition is. So it's one thing to sell you, right? And now that I've closed the sale, let me give you the vaporware, right? Kind of story. But you have to be able to back it up. And I think that employers that are going to be successful in that space are those that have the proposition, are clear about their purpose, who they do and who they don't offer value to, and how they matched that up in terms of what the actual experience on the job is.
Can you be specific about how that's actually caused you or your team to change to some extent? What goes on in your learning and development stuff?
Yeah, one example would be we have a program now called Archways to Opportunity. One of the things in looking at our employee base was about looking at, again, recognizing that we're a first employer and that people are typically on their way or aspiring to be on their way to somewhere else. And one of the things we see is that many of them are aspiring to further their education. So we have a value proposition now for people that come to work for us where we will pay for you to get a high school diploma if you're a dropout. We will provide you with credit for the training you take in our business towards an associate or bachelor's degree. And we will provide funding to you, whether you're a company or a franchise employee, we'll provide funding to you to actually get access and complete education with those universities, and we'll add advising services on top of that completely free of charge for you as someone who can guide you in the selection process, can mentor you through the experience and help the chances of someone actually completing their education. So for us, we're hoping people will stay longer, right? And we're seeing thousands of people taking advantage of it. And on the flip side of that, we are sort of fulfilling what the expectation of the person coming into the environment is that if I go to work at McDonald's, it can actually help me and set me up for something else that I might do later.
So a couple things we're doing is, first off, we've created a group that we call Nextgen, and it's a traditional, employee resource group. But through Nextgen, which would be our millenniums, we're really asking them to come together and to instruct us, almost like reverse mentoring. So we've put that into place to hopefully pull the different ways of thinking and being together. A second thing we're doing is we're doing a lot more virtually. We do work in 63 countries around the world, and through doing a virtual learning session, and it's hard because you've got multiple time zones, but we're really connecting people literally across the world that are doing similar jobs or maybe working on the same job as an engineer or as a person, and that brings teaming that didn't happen before that. And I would say third, what we're really doing is we're really trying to find opportunities where I like to say people are putting skills into their knapsack, and the idea is, this isn't a marriage, you don't have to be here forever, but while we are together, how do you add value to Bechtel and how do we add value to you? And really understanding that employee value equation and seeing that it's working is really important.
I would say I feel like it's almost like the perfect storm of things going on in the environment that we need to pay attention to, right? There's the generational issues, there's the globalization, there's technology, there's probably other things that we need to think about. But as all those three come together, it's really a focus on the immediacy of information, how they can simplify, how they can access it quickly. It really should be accurate. That would help too. So quality of information matters. and it needs to be customized to what they need. Now, I think a lot about what I call our organizational realities. So the fact that we're 100% franchised, the fact that we're extremely geographically dispersed, that we have people entering the workforce that may be on various scales of education and experience levels. And when you start putting all that together, really what we're trying to do is create multiple options, so that I think our typical foundation of knowledge was either classroom or virtual. Personally, I'm just not so sure that that alone is going to cut it. I believe much more in an and strategy than an or strategy, but the reality is you've got to get a lot of information out to a lot of different people, and as you're doing that, the best way to do that oftentimes is going to be virtually. But at the same time, what we're trying to do is reinforce this idea of learning from one another a lot more, and give them frameworks to think about how they can learn from their general manager, or do a little bit more job rotation. And then the last thing that we're doing is we have a very unique opportunity that we're a 24/7 business, so that there's multiple shifts throughout the day, and that means that there's an opportunity to bring information and a common message every single day at every single shift. And so one of the things we'll be introducing probably in the months to come that focus on both learning and culture, putting those two together, is a daily message that'll be short. It'll be maybe 10 to 15 minutes where the people from that shift can come together, and there'll be a common theme across each one of the brands that say, this is what we want to focus on today. Kind of almost put your hand in, who's with me, hooray, let's get going. And focus on what did we do well, could we do a little bit better, and so really learning in the moment.
We're at 72% millennial, and that's pretty profound. I often think that it's easy to be seduced by that number, because the real issue is that you have a multi-generational workforce, and that's really who we are. We tend to do a lot of research, and one of the things that we are anchoring to as we are looking ahead is, the whole talk at the World Economic Forum, which was around the fourth industrial revolution, which is really about people being at the heart of the fourth industrial revolution, not technology. So it's people at the heart of that. And the second thing is, I think some of you are living that reality, which is that of a fluid workforce. And data tells us that even in America, by 2020, 40% of workers are going to be workers on tap or contract. And so, like you, Tim, when you kind of put all this together and some of the other things that you talked about, I think it leads us to some very, very profound decisions that you take about established notions. The biggest thing that I have found myself looking at, for instance, is our notion of how we think about performance, and how we've thought about that for decades and decades and decades. So part of the reason that I've moved here for a while is really focusing on entirely revolutionizing how we think about performance, because we don't believe it's reflective of what our people want. We don't believe it actually drives performance. Research tells us that the way we manage it has nothing to do with what drives individual, team, or organizational performance. So it's asking the fundamental question of what is relevant to a multi-generational workforce, which is highly diverse, and how do you actually get that workforce to flourish? And just coming back and answering some of those basic questions and doing those well.
Do you have any answers to share with us? Yes?
Sure.
particularly around this issue of performance?
Sure. So the kind of backstory to this is that about a year and a half ago, our CEO came and spoke to my boss, our chief HR officer, and said, we are done with performance the way it is. Can you actually come up with a point of view on what it could be? And she promptly turned to me and said, Rahul, can you actually think about this and create a point of view? And I said, sure. It's a good starting point, because I have no qualifications for it. I really don't understand it. All I do know is that I hate it with a passion.
Which is, by the way, typical.
Yeah.
I mean, almost all surveys show people hate their performance evaluation and performance management process, and most data show that it doesn't work at all.
Absolutely. So that was absolutely what was prompting us. And I had just taken over performance management like two minutes ago. So it was perfect for me to start on it. And so we did a quick piece of research. I called it a research sprint. I know with your academic background, you're going to cringe at adding sprint to research, but we actually did that because we felt we could continue doing it for years. So in 2 months, we asked a few fundamental questions, which is what drives great individual performance? What drives great team performance? What are the fundamental factors that do that? So we did a pretty quick external scan. We talked to thought leaders, academicians, neuroscientists. We worked with our organization to identify those companies that were outperforming others over a period of time in their industry and what they were doing. We call them category killers. And then internally, we listened to the voice of our people. So we did these live events around the world to understand both what people were experiencing and what they desired to. And then we talked to our leaders about what their business goals were. There's no point asking them what was broken in performance management. So we didn't ask that question. So when we synthesized all of that, we learned, I think, 3 or 4 what we are now calling as truths, which is 1, great performance happens, no surprise, when people do what they love and what they're great at. 2, engagement doesn't happen at an organization level. It happens at a team level, at an immediacy of the team. If I work with people that complement my strengths and skills, if you're aligned to a common mission, and if you have a high trust equation, great performance happens. 3rd, we looked at our own data, and we found that we were spending an inordinate amount of money, several $100 million, in what we called managing performance, which was actually not creating any outcomes because it was focused on 2 things. It was people spent time documenting stuff in the rearview mirror, or they spent time in closed-door rooms talking about people but not with people. And what we learned was that doesn't create great performance because there's no point telling me what I could have or should have done 3 months ago. None of us can improve performance retrospectively. But if I get feedback in the moment, I can do something about it and improve. And second, labels, ratings, rankings, categories don't drive performance. They put people in boxes, and that does not acknowledge the unique attributes that they have. So we are doing away with that, and instead of ratings, we are going to have actions. And we think there are 3 or 4 actions that would apply to every single person at any given point in time. Those are mutually exclusive, but collectively exhaustive. So we are going to that world. And if I were to put a wrapper around all of this, as we furthered our work and we are implementing this, we realized this is not a system cut over. It's not one system replacing another. It is a cultural revolution. It is behaving and working in ways and engaging that we haven't. It's focusing on our strengths and those of others. It's having authentic conversations of the kind that haven't happened. And so we are unleashing a pretty significant revolution.
Not to overemphasize the consistency issue, but it always is a thing. When Lucy and I talked on the phone, and I think one of the things that is a big challenge for everybody in this learning and development space is that you are teaching people a set of skills and a set of behaviors, and I think the emphasis on behavior is absolutely crucial. And then oftentimes they look around and they see managers or even senior managers who don't always exemplify. Right. So it's kind of like the parents telling you, do as I say, not as I do, right, which poses obviously profound issues to have them get the message when they see things that are going on that are inconsistent with what they've been told they themselves are supposed to be doing and the behaviors they're supposed to be exhibiting. So I'd be curious and interested, and I think it's a very important issue, to hear how your organizations are dealing with the disconnect between oftentimes what people are being told they should do and what they see at least some leaders in the organization doing. We might begin with you since you were the
Wow. Well, first, I'm going to give them a little background on our conversation. The conversation we were having was in our organization, we do believe authenticity and vulnerability, being able to say, I need help, this isn't working, was really important. So we started trying to put in our learning programs, teaching people to be more authentic and vulnerable. And what we found was it's not that people don't want to be authentic or vulnerable. It's that the system doesn't reward it. you say you make a mistake, and next to your name in a black Sharpie pen is Lucy made a mistake. She's no longer a high potential, cross her name out, and it's there forever. And so we were talking that the real thing we had to do was not teach people to be vulnerable and authentic, but to teach our organization to welcome that in. And then that became part of a bigger conversation, and I think we all face it of, you know, what you say and many times what can be modeled are different. And I think with your Abraham Lincoln and all of those, you bring that forward. So how do we deal with that? How do we work that? And what I would say is we make it discussable. And then secondly, so many times the people that you want to say you're not doing it right are people of high power. So how do you manage that power differential in a way? And I don't have an answer for that, except to say it's challenging. And I don't mean that as an escape out,
No.
but if
It is
there was a
challenging.
magic answer, we would do it. And I mean, just recently, I faced that again in my organization. But what I would say is you become the voice that, you know, says the emperor has new clothes, and always keep your resume in your drawer.
I think it's so nuanced. It's so hard to put a finger on that specific issue without talking about a particular instance, right? Because, you know, if you think about it, different levels of actions and inconsistencies would require different levels of accountability. So if I'm, you know, embezzling, or if I'm, you know, I'm suffering an integrity issue or something like that, that may reach a level where there's a greater deal of accountability where you need to take action. There's an organization I worked for previously, and I won't name its name, where there was, you know, every organization has a core set of values, and there was one individual who was fairly consistently not living up to the core values. He was fairly senior level in the organization, and one time he just crossed the line just a little bit too much. And it was up to the organizational leaders to decide what to do, and they could have easily looked the other way and said, you know, that's just another instance of this, and it wasn't particularly egregious, nothing illegal, nothing immoral, it just crossed the values boundary. But they chose to act, and they actually asked the person to leave, and they were out of the organization. And so that, to me, was an example of organizational leadership collectively making a decision that was consistent with its core values based on a pattern of inconsistencies. There's other organizations that I've been a part of that allow certain behaviors to go on, and what that does is that becomes part of the culture. So those stories, for every time you hear somebody get away with something, or there's one leader that's particularly successful that is inconsistent with either what they say or what the organization values, that says that that's okay. Now you have to be really careful, because if you think it's okay, you don't realize that there's a whole set of characteristics and history that goes along with that one person that may make it okay for that person. But if you try to get away with that one instance, it may not work. So that's what I mean when I say it's nuanced. I don't think there's just a one single answer. It's pretty complex.
Yeah, for me, thinking about that too, around you know, the example that you shared, where, you know, in a learning program we're talking about one behavior, but, you know, I leave that program and everybody's like, yeah, that's interesting, but this is how we actually do it. For me, that's a signal of a disconnect somewhere in the organization, either in the aspirations of what you want the behaviors to be, and you're starting in the wrong place, right? So you don't have commitment from the levels above in the organization that really drive it. So you're really starting behavior change in the wrong place. You need to start higher up so that environment trickles down. And the second piece is I think goes to accountability, and that is, you know, does the organization accept or reject the behaviors that are outside of what you're saying you want? And if the organization's willing to accept it, then the intention's not really there. All right, so you're not intentional about your culture, you're not intentional about your values, you're going to leave those to chance, and you're going to get what you get. I think what you find over time, though, is those organizations tend to be less successful, probably tend to have higher turnover, probably tend to have lower engagement, and tend to be places where people are less inclined to want to work.
I just, I'd go back to what Lucy said. It is challenging. It is, I think we can't doubt that. I mean, we recruited 100,000 people last year. And so when you think of consistency, I mean, 100,000 people coming from, I don't know how many cultures around the world. I mean, and you have to build a common and core culture, but some of the things that you're saying it's extremely challenging to do it at scale. So I think one way to do this is to provide tools and a framework to make that easier. And so as we've been thinking about our whole notion of performance, and the right behaviors are critical to that. And we have introduced a framework partnering with Gallup, which you referenced several times, which was, can we help people understand their strengths and bring their strengths to their work and to bring their strengths to their colleagues? And understanding your strengths means also understanding what your non-strengths are, also understanding when you may be overusing those strengths, and bringing those strengths in conversations with your supervisors, with your team members, and making that an integral part of how you operate. When you're a new project team, start by discussing your strengths, start by discussing your priorities, start by, when you have a role change, have a similar discussion. When a new team member joins, have a similar discussion. And so I think that gives people an ability to understand themselves, and it gives a safe environment to actually have these hard conversations, which is, people are not good or bad. People are not, it's how things get overused or their blind spots. And if you bring this framework in, then it allows people to do that. So as we were rolling out performance achievement, right at the end of January, we have enabled for the vast majority of our people to access Strengths Finders. To me, it was astounding that between 28th of January till last week, we had 130,000 people that have gone ahead and taken the Strengths Finders, are setting up coaching sessions. And that's just incredible, because there's a hunger for this. And people actually want to be better, and people want to show up better. So I think there are ways to enable that.
So one of the questions also, I think, relevant to this panel about, authenticity and new leadership styles is the question that we haven't asked or discussed, but it's kind of implicit. And a lot of this is there new leadership for new times? In other words, are there skills that leaders now have to exhibit that even 5 or 10 years ago they did not? And to the extent that you could be explicit and specific, it would be really great.
I'll start with that. I'm very fortunate in that this year I'm going to be married 43 years. And sometimes people, well, thank you. No, he's a good man. But the reason I bring that up is sometimes people say, what is the secret to now 43 years of marriage? And I think there's something that you have to reinvent your marriage. You have to reinvent what it means to be relevant to each other. And when I think of my husband and I as college students together, and with him in the military in the Vietnam era and things like that, we've had to shift, we've had to change, and part of it is that commitment for relevancy, which is different. And I think it's the same thing with leadership. There is something that times change, and companies and the people in companies, we have to redefine who we are and to be relevant. And when you were talking about strengths, I always tell people every towering strength has a soft underbelly. You said overuse it, but there's something there. And how do you switch that, and how do you manage that? And I really do think that we are in a different era. A company can fail because Greece doesn't pay or is going to default. That is so different. Your stock can fall $30 or whatever because of something totally outside and this geopolitical environment that we're in. I was just in Riyadh, and we have women who cannot drive, and yet I was at a woman at Bechtel's meeting with women in burqas and abayas, including myself, and what a powerful group of women. And I'm worried about them in Saudi Arabia, just because it's a different socioeconomic world. So I think there is something about relevancy, and we haven't talked yet, but compassion And I think compassion is also something that we need more of in organizations. And I think we will be better for that, and our leaders will be better for that, including saying good morning before you do the bad news. So I'm done. I'm sorry, I got passionate there.
You're going to, after marriage, you're going to hand it over to me. I don't know if I can back that up. So that's all right. I'll give it a shot. I think part of the question was about new models of leadership. And so I'll just tell a quick story. Not long ago, I was working with a group of senior leaders who had approached me and said, we really need a leadership solution, and we need to really enhance our leadership skills. And I sat down with this very senior group of executives, and I had them, as a first activity, I said, what does successful leadership look like to you? And there were about a dozen people in the room. And I said, write it down on the index card, and then we're going to talk about it. And you may not be surprised to find out that there were probably 10 different definitions of what did successful leadership look like within that one single room, who was gathered together to create enhanced leadership skills for their group. So if we're not even talking about the same language within a room, then when we talk to a room this big, and then we get out to the field even bigger and even bigger. So I don't know that there's a single understanding, but I think what is important is that we have the conversation about, within that organization, within that business group, within that team, what does successful leadership look like? What does successful performance look like here, rather than try to extrapolate that for the entire field or the entire universe. So really be focused down. It was interesting because after that conversation, we were able to come to a unifying definition of what did effective leadership mean, and then we can build towards that for that particular group. But I couldn't take their definition and apply it even to another group within that organization.
I just say, you asked to be explicit and specific, and I don't want to talk about what we are doing, but I think what we are thinking about, because I actually think, to your question, there are times when you have to think profoundly differently, and there are two thoughts. The first is, I think, our immersion thinking, that for the longest time, organizations have focused on a couple of elements of the human. So organizations focus a lot on the brain. How does the brain learn? How can we stuff more learning into somebody? How could we get them to operate in one way or the other? And a bit on the emotion, which is, let's incite loyalty and let's provoke, those kind of emotions. And the reality is that those are 2 out of 4 dimensions that actually show up every single day, because every single human has a physical dimension, a mental dimension, or an intellectual dimension, an emotional dimension, and a spiritual dimension. And that's who is coming in every single day. And so what we are thinking about more and more is the need to be uniquely human and to actually start to recognize all these dimensions. And so, thinking about physical well-being, I think many of us grew up in an era where working hard was extremely good. Data now tells us that we were not being efficient at all, unless you're getting good sleep or good food or nutrition. So I think thinking about the physical dimension is important. I know spiritual can go into many dimensions, but the simplest way we think about it is purpose. So if you think about the 4 dimensions, well, the body is all about being healthy. The intellectual dimension is about challenging work. The emotional dimension is about recognition and connectedness. And I think the spiritual dimension is about purpose. And people increasingly seek a purpose in what they do. So that's where we are heading. I know you're asking for specificity,
No, it's okay. It's
but that's where we find ourselves heading more and more. And the other thing that I find is that many times, I think historically we've thought about leadership as levels, right? So the senior you get, the leader you are, and I think it's interesting. Yesterday I was in front of 500 of our leaders, and we are talking to them about their behaviors and performance and stuff. And we talked about the notion of empowerment, and where we are heading in performance achievement will be about empowering them more and giving them more flexibility. And one of the reactions we got was, well, this won't work, because how can we ask somebody to actually exercise that kind of judgment because they've just got X years of experience, et cetera, which to me is really interesting when you see 27-year-old people leading a $1 billion company more and more as the norm. So I think there's something about this leadership everywhere. And the question is, how do you actually change how you think about what leadership is?
Yeah, I'd be a little challenged on, well, I have a specific, I guess, of where we're starting on this. But I think one of the things I'm hearing, and one of the things maybe anecdotally observed, is this increasing focus around self-awareness, right? So I think it's tied to what Rahul talked about. I think, everybody pretty much is here tied to some element of that, of how do we better understand who we are, what drives us as leaders, or even as individual contributors, not a leader, but as individuals in the organization. I see that trend emerging more and more. You can look at it with the growing industry of life coaches. You can look at it through instruments like Strengths Finders that are immensely popular. And now you see lots of publications out about happiness and yesterday how to build better habits. So there seems to be a leadership trend, or I wouldn't even necessarily call it, maybe it's a personal leadership trend, but I think it translates into the business world as well, around the dimension of self-awareness and self-understanding of who you are, what's important to you, and how you bring yourself and how you represent yourself to other people as well. And I think that's different maybe from the traditional past, which is really about building technical capability and becoming an expert at a particular domain. So for me, I think that's where I see the departure. So at McDonald's, a specific example I would say is we've begun talking to people that run our shifts, sort of a 24/7 business. The people that run our shifts are in first-time leadership management positions in the organization. So we're moving now to having multi-day conversations with them about what's the leadership mindset and how do you need to change how you think about what you do now that you actually have accountability for a greater group of individuals than yourself. And who are you, and what drives you, and how does that transfer over to the people in the organization? And it's amazing to watch their reactions, because they were sitting in roles before, which was about execute to the procedure, right? Because you want your Egg McMuffin the same way everywhere you go. So now we're in a place of raise your head and observe what's going on in the workplace, and how do you react to that, and how do you present yourself and your strengths associated with that? So it's a much different conversation for them than they've expected, but the reaction's been incredibly strong from them about connecting to that emotional side of what being a leader really is all about.
Well, I think we're going to open it for questions, assuming we've got a few minutes. I would say one of the issues I will not put you on the spot with is that I agree with the importance of compassion. I think it's very important. I think it's very, but one of the, I think, profound issues, and I won't put any of you on the spot, is this issue of between what we say and what we do. We talk about compassion. I don't see many organizations that behave in a compassionate fashion. I certainly agree that physical health is important. In fact, two colleagues and I have written a paper that says that there are 120,000 annual excess deaths in the United States from work. I'm writing a book called Dying, with the working title, Dying for a Paycheck. I think the workplace is literally killing people. But I'm looking at you, and I do know something about the organization from which you come. And I'm thinking about, I think, Accenture and low hours are not phrases that typically go together in a sentence. And, and I think the consulting world, I have not so much Accenture, but consulting in general, we send the Stanford Business School, sends lots of people to the McKinseys and to the Accentures and to the Deloittes and to the Bains and whatever. And I know how long our people stay there, and I know why they leave. And so I think organizations, it goes back to a theme that I think comes out of my talk as well. I think, understand extremely well what we ought to be doing in a lot of dimensions of leader and leadership behavior. I'm not 100% sure that we are always perfectly executing against that.
I'm not going to be put on the spot at all, because I think you're spot on right. And the way you do that is to shine data on a problem, and then make that data public. And so, a couple of weeks ago, we actually did an audit, an energy audit with Tony Schwartz, and we did that in a large part of our North American kind of consulting workforce. And that precisely shone a light on the data you said, which is on the physical dimension. We are not, in fact, we're doing nowhere close to what we should. But if we had not seen that data,
That's
then
exactly right.
it's hard to do something about it.
That's
So,
exactly right.
these are challenges we have.
So we
I
want to
just
do,
say-
we want to do questions, or we want to, what do you want to
Go
do?
ahead, keep going.
Let me just say one more thing. And I believe this profoundly. I think when we talk about leadership, we have the stories you had up there. When I look at a human system, which is what an organization is, a human system is made up of human beings, and my experience is people are messy. People are messy. We have hopes, we have fears. I had dying parents for 2 years. We have children that have different things happening in their lives. And I think one of the things we're called to do with our leaders is compassion. Absolutely. Because if you want a workforce of shining knights, it's just not going to happen. That's not our human existence. That's not the path we're on when we have ups and we have downs. And I think a huge part of leadership is compassion. And with compassion, then wisdom. And I don't think we teach enough in leadership. We teach our technical skills, we teach our leadership skills. I think there's a need for a deeper and a more profound wisdom, whether it's around human beings or multi-cultures or the various pieces. And I think if all of us in this room, if we call ourselves to be at that level, I think we're at a greater level of realism. I think maybe some of the fallacies you had up there would be a little bit different. And more than that, this embellishment is that we want the perfect human being, and we're just not that, including myself. So anyways, I'm done.
So one of the interesting questions that I pose, I know him and I know John Mackey in the conscious capitalism movement, and I've gone to a couple of conscious capitalism conferences, and my probably excessive cynical view is that it's the people who believe talking to the other people who already believe. If we are going to make the world a substantially better place along the lines that you just suggested, we need to hold ourselves individually and collectively accountable for not saying, yes, isn't there some interesting stuff and some data that shows that stuff pays off. It's kind of my medical example. Yes, if you wash your hands, the odds of infection go down. But then we need to hold ourselves collectively responsible for asking how many conscious capitalist or compassion or whatever you want to call it companies are there. And if the numbers are not changing or going in the wrong direction, which would be my kind of general perception based upon the data that I've seen, then we need to understand why. I mean, the Great Place to Work Institute for decades has published data which is very consistent with the premise of your question. Companies that rank high on the Great Place to Work list outperform the unmanaged indices, all the other indices. You go talk to the people at the Great Place to Work Institute, which, by the way, itself is not a great place to work, but that's a whole other story. And it's gone through about 5 CEOs in 7 years. But in any event, so then you ask them, has the overall trend level moved? Is there any data for this? No. And so it is more than yes. Yes, there is a connection between doing the things that have been discussed here and high levels of economic performance. And that raises the question of why this is not diffusing more. And I think we have a individual and collective responsibility to hold ourselves accountable, not for the exceptional stories or even for the studies, but for the base rates. The base rate, when I look at the overall levels of employee engagement and overall levels, I know Richard Edelman and the trusted, I do stuff for the Edelman when they roll out their index. You look at the Edelman Trust Index and stuff like this, we need to hold ourselves individually, but also collectively to a higher standard. And one of the things that I see, frankly, among my friends in business, which has come back and sometimes to bite them in the butt, is that what happens in one place, what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. What happens at Chipotle affects people's perceptions of all fast food restaurants and the safety. And maybe, it's not like we're driving one to the other. People now say to me, God knows, have any of the supply chains changed? What happens in one hotel or one Airbnb or not happens, then has profound implications. And so we have as a community, have often been willing to say, well, it's their problem. It's not my problem. It's actually our problem. Do we have any more questions? Are we out of time?
We're right back here, Jeff.
Several of you referred to teams as a great level to lead within and where to get authentic motivation. Teams come from a sports metaphor. Can you talk about how, given your global nature, where these teams are spread out or they're not always in the same team, they're in multiple teams, how do you create that level of connection at the team level, even when people aren't directly reporting in that team structure?
I could go.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I work in a highly global organizations where the vast majority of teams are virtual. And even when you're serving one client, you would have a distributed team working across different dimensions. We're working as a team. So there are just a couple thoughts on that. This is something that we've been working on for years and years now. But first of all, there's some basic elements of what teams need to be cognizant of and what they drive, which is when you're working in these teams, people are not working the same hours. They don't come from the same cultures. They are not even physically present with each other most of the time. So technology in general is a great way to help solve for that. If you have more video communication, if you're using the ability to actually whiteboard together, and all those tools are available. And I think the more you use that, the more teams get better at being more self-sustaining. Right. The second thing that we are now focusing on a lot more is helping teams with the resources that they need to be high-performing teams. So I mentioned strengths, I mentioned priorities, and I mentioned team engagement. All three of those actually come together, and we are actually enabling for all of our teams around the world to be able to do their strengths, to be able to have priorities and share. So our technology would enable, one of the things that you couldn't do in the old performance management system was I had my objectives and you had yours, but we didn't know each other's. And so in the new world, we have priorities, which is what are you focused on right now? And the ability to share that to make sure, well, all of us are focused on what we ought to be focused on. And two, we can hold each other accountable. And then third is we can actually very quickly with, the survey is a 2-minute survey, it's 12 questions. Takes you, 90 seconds to fill it up, and you get results. And then it's completely actionable at a team level. And so you can, as a team, decide what is the most important thing that you can focus on and just pursue those actions to actually do that and say, okay, when do we want to check the temperature again? 3 months later, 4 months later, do that. And like many other, many people, you're part of multiple teams. You mentioned, they're direct reports or not direct reports. I'm part of 3 teams right now, and you can do this in 3 teams separately and actually do that. So I think the base message that I have is being able to provide resources, guidance, and enablement, I think is the best thing we can do. And when teams realize that there's not a big brother watching over them, if the team engagement score is bad, there are no consequences to that because, well, guess what? Nobody else actually can see your engagement survey score. So, that leads to greater and greater self-reliance and sustainability and high-performing teams. So those are some of the things that
I would add to that. We have a largely geographically dispersed team when it comes to learning. And I think establishing a common purpose, going back to your purpose comment from earlier, is making sure we're all focusing on relatively the same thing and then tying that to the expectations for the year. These are the projects we're going to work on. This is how we're going to deliver excellence. This is how we're going to help impact the business. So I think within the team, it's I'll say sometimes easier said to establish that. It's still hard to do. You've got to follow through. You've got to keep the lines of communication open. But what I find a little bit almost challenging that require a little bit work is working across boundaries. And so it's within the team we can all establish, but what happens when that purpose conflicts with or isn't a priority for another team, and how do you really tackle that? And I don't know that I have the answer, but I would say one of the things we strive to do is again, keep that open line of communications and don't wait until you think something has gone too long, but address something. So have those crucial conversations to say, hey, this is something that's important. I'm not going to make my lack of planning or my lack of sharing this with you a crisis on your part, because too often in organizations, I feel that it happens over time where you say, well, this is really, really important for me and my team. Well, it's not important for me. Well, I need this by Friday. And as long as you give people some respect and advance warning and say, look, this is something we're going to be working on and coming to you with, it makes the working across boundaries a little bit easier, but it's a challenge, and you got to work at it for sure.
And just one other quick thought is, when you think of team and you think of teamwork, you're talking about nouns. What we're trying to do is say, what does teaming look like? And if you get into the verb, what is, instead of I'm a team, but what does teaming look like? I think you get into more actionable discussions, whether it's around boundaries or priorities. What would it mean for us to be teaming? And that actually helps a different level, I think, of agreements that are made.